In the spring of 2020, right when the COVID-19 pandemic was really kicking into high gear, students at the University of Nebraska were told to move out of their dorms and move back home with their families to prevent the spread of the virus. One student, 20-year-old Alex Kearns, who was enrolled at Nebraska on an ROTC scholarship, was just as shocked as everybody else at how quickly this pandemic had turned their life upside down. But in terms of going back home again, he wasn't that upset about it because he was close with his family and he figured some unexpected time with them would be nice. Once he got back to his hometown of Naperville, Illinois, which is an affluent suburb outside of Chicago, he quickly fell into a quarantine routine, which consisted mostly of screen time and lounging around. But in the evenings, he would put his screens away and he would go into the kitchen with his mother, Dorothy, and the two of them would chat for hours about all sorts of things. One night, he told his mom that he was feeling kind of nervous about what he was going to do with his life after college, that even though he was studying business out at the University of Nebraska, he didn't really know what he was going to do with that. All he knew was that he wanted to find a way to help people. And his mother and everybody that knew Alex would say that that's just Alex. He was this really gentle, nice, awesome person that everybody just adored. After being home for a few weeks, Alex was starting to get bored of his quarantine routine, and he began looking for other things to do. He had seen a number of ads for a new brokerage app called Robinhood that was becoming increasingly popular amongst people his age. Unlike other trading platforms, Robinhood was designed for the common person. There was not huge fees that needed to be paid by the investor as soon as they logged on, and the app was very sleek, and it turned trading kind of into a game on the app. Alex had a few $1,000s in his bank account, and so he figured, you know what the heck, I'll download Robinhood and see what I can do. What's the worst that can happen? After trading on Robinhood for a couple of days, Alex was hooked, and he showed his family that he was actually making a little bit of money, and he was learning about the stock market. His parents would later recall when they found out he was using Robinhood, they weren't concerned because Alex had always been incredibly careful with his money, saving most of it and very rarely spending much of it, and so they figured, he might lose his savings, but he's certainly not going to fall into significant debt. That's just not Alex. Also, there was a safety mechanism in basic accounts on Robinhood that protected first-time users from going above $10,000 in debt. So even if Alex tried to lose more than that, the app wouldn't allow him so long as he was using a basic account. As the weeks went on, Alex got more and more confident in his trading ability, and he got really familiar with the Robinhood app. And one day he noticed there was one function he had not tried on the app called options trading. For context, traditional trading goes like this. Somebody identifies a stock that they like, and then they gamble on it. And the way they gamble on it is they buy shares of that stock, and if the stock increases in value, they make more money. If the stock loses value, they lose money. Very simple. But some people either can't afford the shares or don't want to buy the shares, but they still want to get in on the action of the stock market. And for those people, they can use something called options trading. Instead of buying shares, options traders will basically sell an insurance policy to other traders who have already purchased shares. And this insurance policy they're offering is known as an option. These option traders will go up to these shareholders and they'll say, for example, I'll give you $500 in exchange if your stock tanks and you're losing a ton of money. You can exercise your option, i.e. cash in your insurance policy, and I, the option holder, will cover all of your losses. But if your stock stays steady or gains in value, I still get to keep your $500. That's non-refundable. Naturally, these options traders, they need to be savvy about which stocks they're prepared to cover with their option. Because if that stock tanks and the shareholder decides to sell, i.e. exercise their option, then the option holder is obligated to immediately buy all of the shares at a premium. And if that shareholder has, let's say, hundreds of thousands of shares, well, too bad, the option holder is buying all of them. So when Alex clicked on the options trading button inside of his Robinhood app, it brought him immediately to an application because Robinhood had to make sure anybody on their app that was going to be buying or selling options, they needed to be an experienced trader and they needed to understand the risks because they were much higher than a basic account. There was no limit to how much debt someone could fall into in trading options. Alex was a smart guy and a motivated trader, but he knew nothing about options trading. And so when he saw this application, I'm sure he thought to himself, yeah, I know nothing about options trading. There's no way I could possibly get into this. But he decided, what the heck? I will apply to go on to their options trading side just to see if they'll accept me. And so he fills out the application and almost immediately he is accepted onto that side of the platform. It would later turn out that application was kind of a sham. It did not really do very much to restrict access to that side. Alex was surprised at his acceptance, but he was also very excited. And right away, he started trading options, and he was pretty good at it. And pretty quickly, he was making a little bit of money. But then on June 11th, he got a notification on his phone from Robinhood. And so he pulled his phone up, he opened the app, and he saw his account was restricted. He couldn't make any new trades, and he couldn't make any withdrawals. And so as he looked at it, he scrolled down to the bottom of the page, and he saw his current balance, and it read negative $730,000. A trader that Alex had sold an option to was exercising his option because his stock had tanked, and he owned over $700,000 worth of shares that now Alex was obligated to buy. Alex couldn't believe what he was looking at, and he immediately fired off an email to Robinhood customer support saying there had to have been a mistake, that he had done the math before he had sold that option, and he thought at most he was exposed to losing maybe $10,000, certainly not $700,000. And so after he sent this email, a couple of minutes later, he got a message back from Robinhood, but it was just an automated response that just said, hey, we got your email and we're busy and we'll be sure to be in touch with you as soon as we possibly can. And so at this point, Alex is starting to panic a little bit because he's looking at his phone and this looks real. He's trying to go through his phone to find some place that would show him this was a mistake, but there's nothing that indicates this is a mistake. And so after a couple of hours, Alex is just laying in his bed, he can't sleep, and he sends another message to the customer support team at Robinhood, pleading with them to please check his account. There has to have been a mistake. There's no way I would have exposed myself to $700,000 of debt. But again, all he gets is an automated response that says, we're busy and we'll be in touch with you soon. A couple hours later at 3:26 a.m., Alex is still awake, probably pacing around his room, totally panic-stricken. And he looks at his phone and there's another email from Robinhood. And he's thinking, oh my goodness, thank you. Someone's gotten in touch with me to tell me this has been a horrible mistake. And so he opens his email and the header of the email is immediate action required. And what it was a notice for him to make his first payment on this enormous debt. It was going to be about $170,000 that he had to pay in the next couple of days. And if he didn't make this first payment, they would seek legal action against him. Alex was probably terrified, and also he was ashamed and didn't want to tell his parents. And so all alone in his room, he writes a third email to Robinhood, now straight up begging them, someone please look at my account. This has got to be wrong. But again, he just got the automated message. And so for the rest of the night, Alex probably laid on his bed thinking the world was just crashing in on him. He knew there was no way he could pay this enormous bill, and if he didn't pay it, he would either go to jail or hand it off to his family, which would financially ruin them. And just the idea of doing that to the people he loved made him sick. He just could not face that as one of his options. And so by the time the sun came up the next morning, Alex had come to a conclusion about what he was going to do. He started by pulling out his phone and pulling up the Robinhood app and screenshotting the dashboard that showed his enormous negative balance. And then he went on his laptop and he wrote a long letter to his family and he put it on his desktop so they would understand why he did what he was about to do. And then he left the house, hopped on his bike, and pedaled away. A couple hours later, a police officer arrived at the Kearns' household and he told them that their son, their brother, Alex, was unfortunately deceased. He had thrown himself in front of a train. The family was beyond devastated. This caught them so completely off guard. It didn't make any sense. Alex was a happy, funny guy with plans for the future. He had shown no indications that he wanted to harm himself. It really just didn't make any sense. And so at some point that day, they went to his laptop, they opened it up, and there was that note he wrote. And in this letter, he explains to his family how he had fallen into this enormous debt on Robinhood. He attaches the screenshot that showed his huge negative balance. And he said it was just crazy that this company would allow a 20-year-old with no income to be exposed to over $700,000 of debt. He thought that was crazy, but he admitted he didn't know that much about options trading and probably shouldn't have been accepted into their program to begin with. And then he tells his family that he did want to live, but unfortunately, this was the only way he could get out of this problem without inflicting enormous financial penalties on his family. And so he believed he was protecting his family when he took his life. 24 hours later, Robinhood sent Alex another email and it said, oh, that $730,000 debt that we said you owed, that was a mistake. You don't owe anybody any money. Alex's family has since filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Robinhood, saying that had they just had a person working their customer service desk, they could have talked to Alex and immediately seen that this was a mistake and it would have saved Alex's life. Their case is still ongoing. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer to buy the like button in order of their favorite food, fried chicken. But before you give it to them, remove the outer crispy layer from all of the pieces. In June of 2011, I had just failed a very stressful and anxiety-inducing underwater test as part of Navy SEAL training, and after I failed this test, my instructor told me to get out of the pool and go over to the corner with the other failures. And so I made my way to the edge of the pool, I climbed out, and I sulked my way to the corner where I saw my other classmates who had met a similar fate on this test. They were all sitting in the corner with their backs to the pool in neat rows. And so I was totally gassed from this test. And so when I sat down, I started dramatically breathing really loud and heaving my chest up and down to show off just how hard my test had been. And about 2 seconds into this ridiculous performance of mine, one of my other classmates who had been sitting in the corner when I showed up, a big 18-year-old kid from Wisconsin named Ephraim Matos, he immediately turned around and made eye contact with me, and through gritted teeth, he just goes, "Shut up! Everybody here is in pain." And then he turned back around. And immediately, I was actually really mad at him because he just totally publicly dimed me out in front of my other classmates. But then it dawned on me, he was right. The job we were trying out for, Navy SEAL, they're not looking for people who just feel bad for themselves all the time. And so I never forgot the lesson Ephraim Matos taught me on the pool deck that day. And I, along with everybody else in the SEAL teams, never forgot the totally insane thing that Ephraim Matos did 5 years later that was picked up by virtually every major news network at the time. Back in 2012, so about a year after our exchange on the pool deck, Ephraim and I graduated and became Navy SEALs. I was assigned to an East Coast SEAL team and he was assigned to a West Coast one. And over the next 5 years, I never saw the guy until I saw him on TV. It was mid-June 2017, and I was on base in Virginia in an office full of other Navy SEALs, and we were wrapping up for the day. I was closing my email and powering down my computer, and I noticed my phone that was sitting on the table suddenly started lighting up with all these text messages from current and former teammates. And so I grabbed my phone, and all the messages said the same thing: turn on the news. And so in this office we were in, there was always a TV that was turned to the news sitting in the corner that was on mute. And so I turned to look at this TV, and on the TV from a distance, all I can see is breaking news and Middle East. And so given our profession, news like that tended to have a direct impact on our day-to-day lives. And so I assumed all these text messages must be about whatever happened in the Middle East. And so I get up, I walk over, I grab the remote, and on my walk back to my seat, I'm turning the volume up, and everybody else in the room is turning around to watch the TV as well. And we start hearing the TV reporters talking about this group of American civilians that had gone to Iraq and taken up arms against the terrorist organization ISIS. And so as they're talking about this group of American civilians, they put on the screen an image of one of these Americans. It was this big bearded guy in his mid-20s carrying an AK-47 rifle standing behind a tank somewhere in the Middle East. And as soon as I saw that picture, I knew right away why I had gotten that flurry of text messages from current and former teammates. It's because we all know this guy. The guy on TV was Ephraim Matos. 5 years earlier, after our graduation, Ephraim checked into his first SEAL team out on the West Coast, and very quickly after he showed up, they deployed to Afghanistan. During one of their missions, Ephraim was in the back of his patrol as they walked across this huge open field as they left this village they had just been in. And so Ephraim, in virtue of being in the back of the patrol, was in charge of looking behind the unit and make sure no one was coming after them. And so Ephraim periodically would turn around and he would look and make sure no one was following them. And then at some point when he turned around, he saw two little girls that couldn't have been more than 5 and 7 years old running out of the village and start running down the road towards them. Now, earlier in the day, when Ephraim and his team had been in that village, they had found a children's backpack lying in the middle of the road. And when they went up to inspect it, it turned out to be rigged with explosives. Now, no one had gotten hurt. They had defused the explosives, but they were very weary for children's backpacks. And so as Ephraim sees these two girls running up to him, he can see they're both wearing similar style backpacks to the one they found in the road. they were suicide bombers. Ephraim began screaming at these girls to stop, go back, don't come any closer, or I'll have to shoot at you. But he could tell they weren't stopping. They were just running up the road. He could see there were tears coming down their face. They were totally upset. They were obviously innocent. They were young kids. They'd been put up to this by the Taliban. But Ephraim, because he was in the rear security of his patrol, he had to deal with them like they were threats. And so at some point when they wouldn't stop, he raised his rifle up, he flipped the gun off safe, and he put his reticle right on one of the girls, and he began applying pressure to his trigger. But right as he was about to squeeze and fire a shot, the girls just abruptly stopped. It's like they knew they were about to be shot. And they turned around and they ran back towards the village. And so Ephraim put his finger off the trigger, he flipped it back on safe, he lowered his rifle, and he breathed a huge sigh of relief. But even though he didn't have to engage these poor girls, that experience totally haunted Ephraim. In fact, of all the combat he got in on that deployment, that experience with those innocent girls had the most impact on him. How could anybody force a child to be a suicide bomber? How could anyone be that cruel? And so by the time Ephraim came back to the United States after that deployment, he had changed. That experience specifically had changed him. Even though he believed in the US government's mission over in Afghanistan and in the Middle East, he felt like he could be doing more for these poor innocent people that were just trapped inside of conflict zones like these two little girls. And so over the next few years, he began looking at different conflict zones all over the world where civilians were in the most danger. And he discovered there was one place that was killing and exploiting civilians at an unprecedented rate. And that place was Iraq, where a new terrorist organization had taken power called ISIS. So in early 2017, when Ephraim's Navy contract ran out and it was time for him to decide if he wanted to stay in the SEAL teams or get out and become a civilian, he opted to not re-enlist, so he left the military, and instead he got on social media and he contacted a foreign volunteer group in Iraq that was providing humanitarian aid to civilians. And he reached out to them and he said, "Hey, can I join you?" And of course, they said, yes, we'd love to have a Navy SEAL come out and support us. And so just a couple of days later, Ephraim sold his house, he packed up a bag of clothes and a backpack, he grabbed his passport, and he hopped on a plane and he flew to northern Iraq all by himself. Now, before we continue the rest of the story, you need to understand just how bold this move was by Ephraim. Now, when he was a Navy SEAL, and so a member of the United States military on active duty, when he went to Afghanistan, to a war zone, he had lots of support. If his team got pinned down by the enemy, they could call in an airstrike or they could call in backup. If Ephraim got hurt on the battlefield or his teammates got hurt on the battlefield, they could call in special medical teams that would fly in virtually any condition to come save them. And if Ephraim got captured by the enemy, you better believe America is coming for him. But in this case, Ephraim went to a war zone as a civilian. He was not in the US military, so he didn't have any of that support. If he or his team got pinned down out in Iraq, they would either have to fight their way out or get killed or captured. If he or one of his new teammates from this volunteer group got hurt, they would have to either save themselves or get killed or captured. And if Ephraim got captured as a civilian, nobody's coming for him. Nobody even knows he's been captured. He is completely on his own. But Ephraim knew these risks. In fact, he knew them better than most people because he had already deployed to a war zone and saw how important it was to have a support infrastructure. So when he flew to Iraq as a civilian, he knew he was hanging it out there, but he just didn't care. He felt like he had a mission to go help these innocent people because nobody else was. When he arrived in Iraq in March of 2017, he was met at the airport by one of the guys from this volunteer group Ephraim was going out to join. He was a very muscular, tattooed American in his mid-30s who introduced himself as Sky, and he said he had been a Marine, and while he was in the Marines, he had deployed to Iraq, so he was familiar with the area. The pair hopped in a vehicle, and Sky drove them to the volunteer group's safe house in the city, where Ephraim got a chance to meet the leader of this group. It was a tough-as-nails former Army Special Forces guy in his mid-50s named Dave. And Dave, for the past several decades, had been going out to conflict zones all over the world, and he would tell Ephraim that the worst atrocities he had seen committed against civilians in any of these places was where they were right now, in Iraq, at the hands of ISIS. A few days later, Ephraim, Sky, Dave, and a few other American volunteers loaded up into this convoy made up of armored ambulances, and they left the city and they headed west into the countryside towards a huge city called Mosul that 3 years earlier had been captured by ISIS. On their journey towards the city, Ephraim and the others had to pass through a number of military checkpoints. Now, most of these checkpoints were stood up by their ally, the Iraqi army. But Ephraim and the others knew that they might stumble upon an ISIS checkpoint, and in virtue of all of them being pale-skinned Americans, they would instantly be recognized as the enemy and fired upon. So every time they slowed down for one of these checkpoints, Ephraim and the others would clutch their guns closely and mentally prepare themselves for a potential vicious close-quarters fight to the death. But luckily, they managed to go the entire distance all the way to the outskirts of Mosul without any checkpoint drama. And once they got there, they linked up with an Iraqi army unit that the leader of this volunteer group, Dave, had a relationship with. Over the first month that Ephraim was in country, he worked with this Iraqi army unit to help distribute food and provide medical care to civilians in and around Mosul. Then, in month 2 of his stay in Iraq, everything changed. Iraqi decision makers decided it was finally time to retake Mosul from ISIS. This was a huge military movement that required several units to work together and would take several weeks. The main Iraqi army was going to push inside of the city limits of Mosul and inch by inch reclaim territory from ISIS, while the army unit that Ephraim and his volunteer group had embedded with would be responsible for reclaiming some of the villages around Mosul that ISIS had occupied. And so suddenly, Ephraim and the rest of his volunteer group went from being humanitarian aid workers to having a direct frontline combat role with the Iraqi army. And in his first civilian combat experience, Ephraim ran across an active minefield towards this village that was occupied by ISIS. And after nearly being blown up at least 2 times, Ephraim finally made it to this village, and he began going house to house with the other volunteers, clearing them of ISIS fighters. And in one instance that he has on camera, he entered into this structure and he saw there were guns on the ground, and they looked around and they couldn't find any ISIS fighters inside, but they noticed on the ground there was a piece of plywood. They moved it aside and it revealed this huge hole that led down into the ground, and this hole connected to a huge underground tunnel system that ISIS used to escape gunfights just like this one. And so Ephraim and Dave, who was with him, just hopped right down into the tunnel. They didn't have night vision, they didn't have backup, just the two of them start running down this totally pitch black tunnel, periodically throwing grenades ahead of them in case there are ISIS fighters ahead of them. And at some point, after running for quite a while, just getting ready to come in contact with their adversaries, they reach this big high-ceilinged cavern that's a dead end. And they're looking around thinking, okay, I guess no one ran in here. But before they turned around and left the tunnel system, they looked up with their lights and they saw high up on the wall, dug into the wall, was another entrance to another tunnel. It looked like there needed to be a ladder to get up to this additional tunnel entrance. And so Ephraim and Dave look at each other and they're thinking, I bet ISIS fighters ran down here, there was a ladder, they climbed up and went in that entrance and then pulled the ladder up so we can't follow them. And so Ephraim and Dave couldn't do anything about it. They decide, okay, well, we'll just go out and we'll tell the Iraqi army and see what they want to do. And so Ephraim and Dave, they leave this tunnel system, they go back outside, they tell the Iraqi army, and the Iraqi army brings in a bulldozer and they fill in that entrance they had found inside of the house, completely seal it up so nobody could go in or get out. And then later that night, after that village had been cleared of all ISIS fighters, they began hearing muffled explosions underground near where this entrance to this tunnel was. And what it turned out to be was ISIS fighters that realized they had been buried alive. They had snuck down there. They had used a ladder to get up into that crawl space. But when they realized they were doomed, they blew themselves up. For the next month, Ephraim and the Iraqi army unit that he and his volunteers were working with continued to periodically get into small skirmishes with ISIS in these villages outside of Mosul, but the majority of their time was spent providing humanitarian aid and medical care to civilians in the area. Then in May, their mission changed again. The other Iraqi army units that had been sent directly into Mosul a month earlier to inch by inch eradicate the area of ISIS fighters, they had done a relatively good job, but the last few ISIS fighters had been pushed up into this northern section of the city where they had bunkered down inside of these blown out concrete structures, and they were putting up an unbelievably fierce fight. So fierce, in fact, that these Iraqi army units in the city were not able to go any farther forward. They needed armored vehicles and tanks tanks if they were going to be successful. And it just so happened the army unit that Ephraim and his volunteer group had embedded with, that had been outside of Mosul this whole time, they were an armored unit. They had armored vehicles and tanks. And they were ordered to head right into the heart of Mosul and liberate it once and for all. And so on May 4th, Ephraim and the other volunteers loaded up in their armored vehicles, and they joined this huge line of dozens and dozens of tanks and other armored vehicles looking at the western side of Mosul. There was just a field between them and the city walls. And as soon as this massive convoy began moving forward towards the city just opened up on them. Heavy machine gun fire, rocket fire, mortars. It was just absolute chaos. ISIS knew they were coming, and so they were unleashing everything they had on them. And Ephraim would say, after his vehicle actually got inside of the city limits of Mosul and was on one of their roads, all these booby-trapped cars began detonating all around them, and the machine gun fire and rocket fire and mortar fire only intensified. At the same time this was happening, Iraqi civilians inside of Mosul saw this unbelievable wave of violence happening, and they began trying to flee the city. Now, ISIS had effectively kept them hostage inside of Mosul because they needed lots of civilians in and around the area, because it prevented Iraq and America and other forces that were fighting ISIS from indiscriminately bombing Mosul to get rid of the ISIS presence there. And so when ISIS saw these civilians running away, they began shooting them to deter other civilians from trying to escape. And so right in front of Ephraim, as he's driving into the city, men, women, children are just being gunned down all over the place. Naturally, Ephraim and the other volunteers hopped out and tried to return fire at these ISIS shooters, but they were so well fortified in different structures, they couldn't even see them, let alone hit them. So they did the next best thing. Ephraim and the others began putting themselves out in the open to draw fire on themselves so that other nearby civilians could run to safety. And for the next 3 days, that's what they did, constantly exposing themselves and dodging bullets. And then also, when they weren't doing that, they were treating these civilians that had been wounded and other Iraqi soldiers that had been wounded. Now, to this point, Ephraim had seen combat when he was in the United States Navy as a Navy SEAL, and he'd seen combat as a volunteer with this group. But it wasn't until he got inside of Mosul that he saw just how barbaric humans can be to one another. He said he saw so much death and dying all around him that it was like his brain couldn't compute that level of barbarism. He would later write a book called The City of Death, and it was about his experience in Mosul. And he said the reason he named the book The City of Death is because that's what it felt like. Everywhere around him was just death. For the next several weeks, Ephraim and the other volunteers took up a position in the south section of Mosul inside of this bombed out building. They created a sort of aid station, and there they focused all of their attention on trying to treat as many wounded civilians and wounded Iraqi soldiers as they possibly could. At the same time, the rest of the Iraqi army had pushed north and was slowly chipping away at the last few ISIS fighters. On June 1st, so roughly 1 month after Ephraim and the others have entered into the city of Mosul, they noticed a significant uptick in the number of wounded civilians that were coming to them for help. And so all day and all night, they're treating all these people that are horribly wounded with gunshot wounds and other wounds. And so at some point, Ephraim and the others begin asking these people, what happened to you? This seems unusual that so many people would show up with these wounds. And they all just seemed to be in shock. No one was able to really talk about what happened, but a few people mentioned there had been a massacre somewhere nearby. But when they pried for more information, there was a language barrier issue, and there was just the fact that they were overwhelmed with patients, and they needed to make sure their focus was on treating them, not talking to them. The following morning, though, Ephraim and the others got up and decided they wanted to push farther north into ISIS-held territory to see if there was evidence of a massacre, to try to figure out what happened to all these people that were showing up wounded. And so Ephraim and the other volunteers, they left their aid station building and they moved north about 1 block to this huge intersection, and there they tucked up against this huge concrete wall that protected them from ISIS. ISIS was down the other road that ran through the intersection. They were holed up in this huge bombed out hospital that overlooked this intersection. And so from where they were, ISIS couldn't see them and they couldn't shoot them. At some point, Ephraim poked his head around this wall, looking down the road towards this burned out hospital, and what he saw along the road shocked him. There were dozens and dozens of civilians that had been killed laying all over the place. It would turn out the day before, a huge group of civilians had attempted to flee the city, and they ran in front of that burned out hospital where ISIS was, and they gunned them down. and they killed over 200 civilians, men, women, children. They didn't care, and they wounded at least 100 others. And so that was why there was that huge uptick in wounded civilians the day before. And so as Ephraim is scanning this carnage, being careful not to stay exposed for too long, he notices one particularly large pile of bodies. There's about 20 or 30 bodies. He sees in this pile, there's clearly movement. And he can see there is a little girl who's attempting to hide herself under her dead mother's clothing. And then next to this girl were two other adult men that clearly were wounded, but were alive. Ephraim immediately starts yelling to them to run to him, you're gonna get killed out there. But the three of them were completely shell-shocked. For the past 24 hours, they had been laying inside of this pile of bodies. And so they were not going to be able to move on their own. And so Ephraim realized unless they did something to get them out of there, they were going to die. So Ephraim and the others ran back to their Iraqi army counterparts, and they got them to sign off on a rescue mission. And their plan was they would have one of the Iraqi tanks drive down that road straight towards that hospital where all the ISIS fighters were, and right behind the tank would be an Iraqi Humvee, inside of which would be Ephraim and the other volunteers. And so they would go straight down the road. The tank would serve as a sort of shield for the Humvee, and after the tank passed the pile of dead bodies, the Humvee would be lined up right next to it. Ephraim and the others would hop out, they'd grab the girl and the two other men, pull them back in the Humvees, and then the two vehicles would back up to safety. Once this plan was in place, Ephraim and Dave and the other volunteers contacted the American military in the area, and they got them to authorize a smoke screen. They would fire artillery shells with air-burst smoke grenades that would obscure the view of the ISIS fighters in the hospital. They wouldn't actually be able to see the tank or the Humvee or this rescue operation taking place right in front of them. And so shortly after these plans are totally finalized and Ephraim and the others are loading up in the Humvee and they're getting in position to turn that corner and begin this operation, the driver of the Humvee says, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. It's not safe. I'm not willing to do it. Ephraim and the other volunteers tried to convince him to still do the operation because they didn't have time to get a replacement Humvee, and they had already coordinated with the American artillery units that were going to be firing these shells at a certain time, and so they really didn't have an opportunity to do this operation again if this guy backed out. Not to mention, if they didn't get out there quickly, these three people were going to die anyways. And so finally, when Ephraim realized this driver was not going to budge, he was not going to go in this operation, Ephraim and the others got out of the Humvee and they walked up to the tank driver and they asked him, are you still prepared to go on this rescue operation? And he said he was. And so even though if they went through with this mission, it would mean Ephraim and the others would be on foot behind the tank, completely exposed, they were still totally down for doing it. In fact, Ephraim would say at no point did they consider canceling the mission. They were so focused on saving these three people that they were prepared to sacrifice themselves to do it. And so the tank driver closed his hatch, Ephraim and the others got behind the tank, they turned that corner so they're facing the hospital, and then a couple minutes later, as planned, American artillery launched these airburst smoke grenades that totally obscured ISIS's view. And as soon as those smoke clouds were in the air, ISIS came out and just started firing randomly straight down in the general direction of where this tank was. They couldn't really see the tank. They had no way of knowing what they were doing out there. They just knew something was going on. And so meanwhile, Ephraim and the others are tucked up behind this tank as it's slow rolling in, as rounds are impacting all around them, mortars start landing all around them, and it turns out there were other ISIS fighters, not just directly ahead of them in the hospital, but also off to their side in other buildings. So they were getting hit from two directions. Ephraim remembers as he was behind this tank trying to stay as small as he could, he began dry heaving because he was so terrified. He was completely convinced he was going to die that day. Eventually, the tank made its way just past this pile of bodies, and at that point, Ephraim actually stepped out and fired back towards ISIS in the hospital and over towards the berm to provide some cover fire, while Dave and another volunteer ran over and pulled the girl and the other two men out of the pile and behind the tank. The girl and one of the men were okay. They were not badly physically hurt, but the other man was badly hurt and he couldn't walk. And so thinking quickly, Ephraim and his team found a piece of sheet metal on the ground behind this tank, and they rolled him onto it and used it like a stretcher and began dragging him as the tank began moving in reverse. And so as bullets are still flying all around them, rockets are landing next to them, they're moving, they're making good progress, when the wounded man slips off of the sled and he lands right in the tracks of where this tank is going to go. And for a variety of reasons, Ephraim and the others had no way of communicating with the tank driver. So the tank driver is just going to keep on moving, and he's going to run over this injured man who can't go anywhere. And so thinking quickly, Ephraim leaps down, he grabs the injured guy, and he rolls with him out of the way of the tracks right as it goes past him. But now Ephraim and this wounded man are outside the protection of the tank, and rounds start impacting all around them. The smoke screen at this point is pretty much cleared, and so ISIS sees them. And Ephraim at this point makes a heartbreaking decision. He looks at this guy who he knows cannot move himself. He's badly wounded. He makes eye contact with him. He holds his hand, and Ephraim just shakes his head and says, "I'm sorry," because he knew he couldn't move him fast enough behind the tank before both of them got shot, and he couldn't throw him on his back in time before both of them got shot. And so he had to leave him. And so Ephraim jumped up, he leapt behind the tank right as a volley of fire hit right where he had been standing, and then Ephraim and the others continued moving back. That wounded man would go on to be killed by ISIS. Only a few moments after Ephraim was back behind the relative safety of the tank, he suddenly fell to the ground and felt a pain in his right leg. He had been shot through the leg. But where he fell was right in line with where one of these tank treads were coming. But again, they can't talk to this tank, so they can't stop the tank from running him over. And so a surge of adrenaline came over Ephraim, and he leapt up onto his feet and just continued hobbling behind the tank despite this gaping hole in his leg. Eventually, they made it all the way back to that intersection where they had started, but the only way they could get back down the alleyway to safety with the Iraqi army was to run across a small segment of this street. Basically, you needed to be exposed for just a second running across. But at this point, the smoke screen was gone. ISIS knew exactly where they were, and they were waiting for them to pop out from behind that tank. And so Ephraim and the other volunteers are screaming across this gap in the road towards the Iraqi army to get them to send an armored vehicle across this road, pick us up, and bring us back across. We can't run across this gap without getting shot. But because of the chaos and the noise, the tank is firing, there's mortars, there's rockets, there's gunfire, it's crazy. The message was just not received. And so in a sudden fit of madness and frustration and fear and all sorts of things, Ephraim just runs across the street. And he gets to the other side miraculously without being hit again. And there he tells the Iraqi army, send an armored Humvee across this gap, get the girl, get the guy, get the rest of the volunteers, save them. Seconds later, an armored Humvee crossed that gap. They picked them up and brought them back. And at this point, Ephraim is now lying on the ground behind that concrete wall. So he's relatively safe, and he's getting his leg bandaged up. And he remembers when the girl and the guy were brought out and they were safe and alive, the Iraqi army erupted in cheers. It was this unbelievably happy moment in an absolutely tragic, horrible time. The Iraqis would transport Ephraim in an armored ambulance to an aid station south of where this intersection was, and there they would put him on a cot, and a doctor would rebandage his leg, and then he would walk away. And so Ephraim is left inside of this room to kind of think about what had just happened, and he looked over to his left, and just 2 beds over from him was the girl he had just nearly died saving. And she was sitting on her cot. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking straight ahead. Her dark hair was matted down, and she was just kind of staring into nothingness. It was clear she was still in shock, but she did look relatively unhurt. And then at some point, another Iraqi doctor came over and gave her some food and water, and she ate and drank ferociously. Ephraim just stared at her in awe. At that moment, she was the most important thing in his life. And as he's staring at this miracle child, the doctor that had given her food and water noticed him staring, and he came over to Ephraim and he just said, "Her name is Demoa. She's 4 years old, and she's going to be just fine." After the doctor had walked away, Ephraim pulled his hat down over his face and he just wept. Ephraim never had a chance to actually speak to Demoa because she was so scared of everyone around her that he decided to just give her her space. But he would later find out that she was reunited with her living family members, and today she is alive and well. After his injury, Ephraim was sent back to the United States, and it was then that he learned their rescue operation had been filmed by a guy who was there that day documenting war crimes by ISIS. He saw this rescue operation happening, and he just started filming it. After this man posted the footage online, it went viral, and before long, major news outlets all over the world were reaching out to Ephraim and the other volunteers for interviews. This was the story that me and my teammates in Virginia in that office saw in 2017, and that image we saw of Ephraim standing behind the tank with the AK-47, that was moments before he rushed out behind the tank and provided cover fire for Dave and the other to run over and grab the girl and the other 2 men. The gunshot wound that Ephraim sustained in his leg wound up being relatively minor, if you consider gunshot wounds to be minor. It did not hit an artery and it did not shatter his bone. And so after only a few months, he was more or less back to strength, and instead of just taking it easy, he was in another conflict zone in Burma, this time working with a new volunteer organization, one that he founded called Stronghold Rescue and Relief. And their mission is to protect and care for families in conflict zones. Their motto is, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please drop a 2,000-pound JDAM on the like button. In 1918, during World War I, British soldier Henry Tandy found himself stationed inside of a trench in northern France. By this point, Henry was already considered a war hero, and he would go on to become the most decorated British soldier in World War I. But his awards are not what he is remembered for. On September 28th of that year, after a long day of fighting, Henry was propped up on the edge of his trench looking out towards the German line. It was dark and quiet, and there was mist in the air, and at some point, Henry noticed a figure way off in the distance walking towards him. Henry instinctively raised his rifle, but he didn't pull the trigger. He wanted to make sure who he was shooting was his enemy, because it could be one of their own men who got wounded and was making his way back to the trench. And so Henry's looking down his gun, staring at the sky, waiting to figure out who he is, and after a few seconds, out of the mist walks a badly wounded German soldier, so it is his enemy, but he wasn't carrying a weapon, and he didn't appear to understand he was walking directly into Henry's sights. Henry aimed his rifle right at this German man's heart, but he didn't pull the trigger, and the man just continued to walk directly towards Henry until he got about 30 meters away, at which point he stopped and looked up and realized his mistake. But instead of trying to run away, he just stood there and stared at Henry, seeming to accept the fact that he was about to die. Now, Henry had shot many men during the war so far, but he just could not bring himself to shoot this unarmed, wounded German who just looked kind of pathetic. And so with Henry's gun still up, he glanced to his left and he glanced to his right to make sure nobody was watching, none of his comrades were going to see this, and then he lowered his gun. And then Henry and this German man just stared at each other for a while until the German man just nodded his thanks, turned around, and wandered back into the mist out of sight. The man Henry had just saved was Adolf Hitler. In the early morning hours of June 10th, 1994, Deborah Hoyt suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She and her husband were staying with relatives in Sacramento, California, and they were supposed to be there for the next couple of days. But as she was sitting there, she had this overwhelming urge to want to leave right then and there and head back to their home in Lake Tahoe. Because she didn't really know what to make of this overwhelming feeling, she shook her husband awake and told him about it. She thought that maybe something was wrong, and he said, "You know what, you probably just had a bad dream and you're kind of waking up still half in your dream. It's not a big deal. Just go back to bed. I'm sure everything is totally fine. And in the morning, if you still want to, I'd be happy to leave." And so Deborah said, "Yeah, you're right. I'm totally overreacting. I'm sure it was just a dream." And she laid back down to try to go back to sleep. But as she laid there, that sense of dread that something was wrong and that she had to leave right now, it was just growing and growing and growing until she just jumped out of the bed and she's just standing in the room and she says to her husband, "Honey, we gotta go right now. I don't know what's wrong, but we gotta go right now." And her husband did not want to go. And he said, "Come on, Deborah, get back in bed. It's not a big deal." But she was adamant. She said, "Get out of bed. We're leaving right now." And so begrudgingly, her husband said, "Okay, we'll leave right now." And so the two of them hastily packed up and then went downstairs and left a note for their relatives explaining their absence, and then they got in their car and they drove off. After a little while, the couple reached a very dangerous section of their journey back home. It was called Bullion Bend, and it was a very windy road up in the mountains where one wrong turn and you're going flying down the side of a mountain. After driving through this area for about 15 minutes, they rounded a particularly sharp turn, and as soon as they made the turn and could look down the road, Deborah, who was in the passenger seat, she saw up ahead on the right, off the side of the road several feet, something that was just lying there on the side of the road. She didn't know what it was. She thought it was maybe a bag or some trash or maybe a dead animal. And at first she was just going to dismiss it. But as her husband drove closer and closer to it, the light began to illuminate it, and she looked at it and couldn't really discern what it was until they were right next to it. And she looked out her window and she noticed it was a woman's body, a woman who had no clothes on, who was just lying there totally motionless. And Deborah immediately turns to her husband and says, "Honey, I just saw saw a dead woman on the side of the road. And her husband immediately is kind of panicked and doesn't slow down. He just keeps driving and says, hey, should we stop? Should we turn around? I mean, maybe she's not dead. Maybe we can help her. But Deborah at this point is now terrified, and she's saying, no, keep going. Don't go back. I bet it's a trap. Someone probably put her there, and they're going to lure us in, and they're going to attack us if we try to stop and help her. And so in this kind of chaotic, frenzied reaction that Deborah and her husband are having, they decide that their best course of action is just to drive on and find the next payphone and call the police. And it just so happened that less than a quarter of a mile away was a ranger station with a phone. And so they pull into the parking lot, and Deborah calls the police. The police tell her to wait inside of her car, and they'll be out in a couple of minutes, and they're going to need her to bring them up to where she saw this body. So a couple of minutes goes by, the police show up, and they tell them to drive back up the road, but stop about 200 yards short of where you believe this woman's body is. And so Deborah and her husband, they get back in the car, they drive back up the road where they came from, and right at this point where the road turned very sharply is where Deborah knew on the other side of this turn would be this body. And so they pulled over on the side of the road, the police came up on their side, and they said, yep, right around the corner, you're going to find her lying on the ground on the left side. And so Deborah and her husband are just sitting in the car watching as the police go up, they make that turn, and they kind of disappear out of sight, and then they see their spotlight moving around on the other side of this turn, and so they figure, okay, they're looking for the body. But after several minutes, the police came back down the road, and they stopped next to Deborah's car, and they said, you know what, guys? We didn't see anything up there. There wasn't a body. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary. And Deborah would say to police, I'm not lying. I know what I saw. It was a woman's body right there in front of me. I know it. It's right over there. And they would tell her that we believe you, but we can't do anything because there's nothing up there. And so they told Deborah and her husband to just head home, and they did. After Deborah and her husband took off and were gone, the two responding officers drove back to their police station, and once they were inside, they began speculating about what Deborah might have seen. And as they were talking, another officer came into the station, a guy by the name of Rich Strasser, and he overhears them, and he goes over, he's intrigued, and he asks them, what happened? What did you see? And they explained to him that this woman, Deborah, had spotted a supposed dead woman's body up on Bullion Bend. And as soon as he heard Bullion Bend, Rich remembered that just a couple of days ago, they had received a missing person report of a young woman named Christine Skubish and her young son named Nick, who had gone missing, and the last place they had been seen was up on Bullion Bend. And so Rich wondered if maybe there was a body up there, and maybe it was Christine's. And so the next morning, Rich got up early and he headed out to Bullion Bend, and when he reached the exact spot where Deborah had claimed to have seen this dead woman's body, he found a children's shoe. And so he stopped his car, he got out, he picked the shoe up, and he's looking around and he's looking for anything else that's out of the ordinary, but there's nothing on the road, there's no skid marks, there's no other debris, there's no other clothes, there's nothing. And so he walks over to the guardrail that overlooks this very steep embankment, and he looks down the other side, and at first all he sees is just trees everywhere, but as he's looking, he thinks he sees more clothing farther down the mountain. And so he climbs over the guardrail and he very carefully maneuvers his way down, and after only a couple of seconds, he reaches a clearing in the branches and the trees, and he can see down to where the train kind of levels off, and right down there is a smashed up red four-door sedan. It was the same type of car that Christine Skubish had been driving when she went missing. And so Rich ran down the mountain, following debris all the way to this wrecked car. He goes around to the driver's side and he looks inside, and there in the driver's seat is Christine Skubish, and unfortunately she was deceased. And then on the passenger seat is her son, Nicky, and he is alive, but barely. He had gone 5 days without food or water. And doctors would say when Rich found him, he probably only had about 1, maybe 2 hours before he would have died as well. Authorities believe Christine fell asleep at the wheel and she drove off that embankment. Initially, Rich believed Deborah must have seen Christine when she was driving through the mountains and saw that woman on the side of the road. After her accident, Christine must have gotten out of her car and then climbed up that embankment and then laid on the road, hoping someone would see her, and then when no one stopped for her, she went back down to her car where she ultimately died. But according to the coroner, that would have been impossible, because when Christine crashed off the road, she died on impact 5 days before Deborah saw that woman on the side of the road. So it could not have been Christine. To this day, no one knows for sure who or what Deborah saw on the side of the road. But it is objectively true that Rich only investigated Bullion Bend and found Nikki alive because of Deborah's police report about this dead woman on the side of the road. And Deborah was only on that road because she had had this totally weird middle of the night urge to suddenly leave a relative's house and drive up into the mountains, something she had never felt before and didn't really know how to explain. So either this is an extremely strange set of circumstances, or Nikki had a guardian angel. In early 1983, residents of the Cranley Gardens apartment complex in North London began complaining about their drains being clogged up. Initially, their landlord was dismissive and said, "Oh, it's just an old building, it's old plumbing, and that's why it's slow." But eventually, the landlord conceded and asked a plumber to come out and have a look. And so, on the evening of February 8th, an experienced plumber named Mike came out to Cranley Gardens, and after learning what the complaints were, he went around to the side of the building and he opened up a drain cover to have a look inside. As expected, when he shined his light down, he saw wads of hair and napkins and other things kind of mashed together, clogging up the pipes. And so he reached in and he began pulling the stuff out and putting it in a bucket right next to him. And then after he had cleared the majority of the obstruction, he reached his arm all the way into this pipe to feel around to see if there was anything in there that he just couldn't see. And at some point, as he was reaching, when his arm was almost completely into this pipe, his hand hit a major blockage. And so he moved his fingers around to try to feel what it was, but he couldn't tell. It was something that was fairly soft, but there were some hard things inside of it, like sticks or rods. So he grabbed a handful of this blockage and he pulled his arm back out of the pipe. He opened his hand, and what he was holding looked like ground meat, but it wasn't any meat he had ever seen before. And inside of this fleshy substance looked like little bits of bone. Now, Mike had cleared many pipes before, and he had never seen meat be the reason for a blockage. And so this whole situation just seemed really strange, and he decided, it's late, I'll just come back tomorrow with my supervisor so he can see what this is too. So Mike puts the cap back on the drain pipe, and he walks out from behind the building back out towards his truck parked on the road. And as he's walking, two of the residents of this complex come out and they say, "Hey, did you fix the blockage? What was it?" And Mike would say no, he hadn't. And then he just kind of blurted out that there was meat in the pipes. That was what was causing the blockage. And then one of these two residents says, "Well, I bet people are just flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken down the drains. That's what's causing it." And Mike looked at him and he was like, "Yeah, maybe." And then he just turned around, got in his truck, and he drove away. Early the next morning, Mike and his supervisor came back to Cranley Gardens, and they went around to the side of the building. They undid that cap, and then Mike reached down inside expecting to feel this blockage, but where it should have been, there was nothing. Somebody had cleared the pipes. And so Mike and his supervisor are looking at each other, and Mike is like, "There's no way that cleared on its own. Someone had to have come out here and cleared it, but I don't know why they would have done that and still had us come out." But the men decide, maybe by chance it did just kind of slip through and cleared itself, so let's just continue the process and make sure each of the apartment buildings, their individual pipe is unobstructed. And when they checked these pipes, they found all of them were clear except for one, apartment number 23, whose pipe was blocked up with more of this meaty substance. Mike and his partner were already very suspicious of the fact that someone had snuck out here in the middle of the night and cleared the pipe. Probably. They didn't know if that happened, but it seemed likely. And now they're finding more of this weird meat substance coming from a particular apartment. And so the whole situation just seemed off. And so they told the landlord that they were not going to touch this. Somebody else had to come out and deal with this. And the landlord, after finding out there was meat jammed in the pipes, got really freaked out and called the police. The police showed up, they pulled this meat substance out of the pipes, and they sent it to a mortuary where a pathologist looked at it and said, "This is meat. It's human meat." And in particular, the stuff that was pulled out of apartment number 23's pipes is that of a human neck. So the police go back to Cranley Gardens, they go up to apartment number 23, they knock on the door, and when the door opens, they're hit with this overwhelming stench of just rotting flesh. And standing in the doorway of this apartment, the owner of the apartment, is this guy who's in his late 30s, early 40s, who introduces himself as Dennis Nielsen. And they say, "Hey, Dennis, can we have a look around your apartment?" And he says, "Why?" And they say, "Well, we found human remains in your pipes." And Dennis immediately says, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe that. That's horrible." But the police are not buying it, and they say, "You know what, Dennis? Tell us where the rest of the body is." And at this, Dennis suddenly went expressionless, emotionless, and he just turns around and he points into his bedroom and he says, "It's in 2 plastic bags in my closet." And so before the police go into his apartment to go inspect these bags, they say, "Dennis, are there any other bodies in your apartment that we should know about?" And Dennis sighs and he looks up to the ceiling and says, Yeah, there's about 15 or 16 here. It's a long story. It goes way back. I'd love to tell it to you, get this off my chest, and I'll do it at the police station. So after Dennis was arrested and brought to the station, he told them his horrible story. It had all started 5 years earlier in 1978 when Dennis was 33. He was at a pub having some drinks by himself when a teenager came into the bar and attempted to buy an alcoholic drink, and he was denied service. And so Dennis pulled him aside and said, "Hey, I'd be happy to give you a drink at my apartment. It's right down the road." And the young man, whose name was Steven, was very excited about this and said, "Great, let's go." Once they arrived back and they were up in Dennis's apartment, the pair had lots of drinks and they were having fun and laughing, and then at some point the pair climbed into bed together. The next morning, when Dennis got up, his new friend, Steven, was still sleeping right next to him. And he had this sudden, overwhelming sense of dread because he knew as soon as Steven woke up, he would see this as a one-night stand and he would just leave. He would not stick around and remain friends with Dennis. And Dennis just did not like that idea. He wanted Steven to stay. And so he looked on the ground next to the bed and he saw the necktie that Steven had been wearing was on the ground. And so he got on the ground, he grabbed the necktie, he fashioned it into a noose, and then he climbed back on the bed, got on top of Steven's chest, and he looped the tie around his neck, and then he pulled it as tight as he could. And as soon as it was tight, Dennis would tell police that Steven came alive, and he began reaching for his neck and kicking Dennis as hard as he could, but he just can't get it off. And at some point, Dennis said Steven just seemed to give up. He looked up at Dennis and knew he wasn't going to get this off and that Dennis was determined to kill him. And so Steven just allowed himself to go limp, and then he slouched over. And as soon as that happened, Dennis said he relaxed. But as he's looking at Steven, he realized he wasn't dead. He was just unconscious. And so Dennis goes into the kitchen and he gets this huge plastic bucket and he fills it up with water and he sets it in the middle of his kitchen floor. And then he gets a bunch of kitchen chairs and he lines them up like a table right in front of this bucket of water. And then he drags Steven's body into the kitchen and he lays him on his back on these chairs, but make sure his head is not resting on the chair. His head is kind of dangling off the back of these chairs. And then he grabbed that bucket of water and he slid it right underneath Steven's head. And then Dennis got on top of the chairs, on top of Steven, and then he pressed the young man's face straight down so his head went backwards until his mouth and his nose were under the water. And Dennis held him like that until Steven regained consciousness, but again, he didn't fight it. He knew he was doomed. And after several minutes, the bubbles stopped coming to the surface and Steven was dead. Dennis pulled his victim off of the chairs, he brought him into the living room and he sat him on a chair. And then Dennis went into the kitchen and he made himself a cup of coffee and he smoked some cigarettes. And then he just stood in the doorway and looked at Steven's body. And he would tell police it was a very bizarre experience because Steven still looked like he was alive. In fact, Dennis would try talking to him as if he was going to talk back, but obviously he didn't. And at some point, Dennis realized, the life he had before he killed Steven was now over. He had a new life and he didn't really know how to handle it. And so the first thing he thought to do was to clean Steven. So he took Steven's body and he brought him into the bathroom and he gave him a very long bath, cleaned his body, cleaned his hair. And then afterwards he got him out, he dressed him and put him into his bed. And then Dennis climbed into bed with him and laid with him. And he would tell police as he laid there, he suddenly felt overjoyed. Steven was not going to leave him. He was going to stay here as long as Dennis wanted him to. After laying with him for some time, Dennis realized he had to find a way to hide Steven's body in his apartment so no one could find him. And so he left his apartment and he went to a hardware store where he got an electric knife and a big storage bin. And he brought them back to his apartment, and as he was about to cut Steven up, he just couldn't go through with it. So instead, he just climbed into bed and took a nap next to Steven's body. When he got up again, he moved Steven's body onto the ground in his living room and covered him with a blanket. And then he went and made dinner and then sat in his chair in the living room right next to this body on the ground and watched TV for a while. When he was done watching TV and eating, he looked at the body on the floor and realized, he really hadn't made any progress in terms of hiding him somewhere in his apartment. And that's when he remembered he had a loose floorboard in his apartment. And so he went over to the loose floorboard, he pulled it up and he saw there was a space under the floors. And so he pulled a couple more boards up and then he grabbed Steven's body and he attempted to force him down into this space. But by now, Steven's body had begun to stiffen up from rigor mortis. Specifically, his arms were outstretched like a Y over his head. And so as Dennis is trying to force him down in there, his arms were not allowing him to go down into that small space. So Dennis took Steven's body and he propped him up against the wall in his bedroom. So the body is against the wall, rigid, standing up with its arms up over its head, and Steven's eyes were still open. And then after that, Dennis just got in in bed and fell asleep. So all night, this corpse is staring at Dennis in his bed. And then the next morning when Dennis got up, there was Steven still up against the wall with his hands in the air looking down at him. Dennis grabbed Steven's body and put it on the ground, and he began yanking and jerking and pulling on each of Steven's arms until they were pinned down by his side. And then after that, Dennis started working on his legs and his hips, and he began contorting him until he was small enough that he could pack him down under his floor. And then once he was under there, he just put the boards on top and went about his daily life. And for the next couple of days, he totally forgot about Steven. But a week after putting him under the floor, Dennis decided he missed Steven and he wanted to see him again. And so one night he opened up the floorboards, he looked down, and there was Steven, and Dennis would say it looked like he was dirty. So he pulled him out of the floor and he gave him another bath. And then after he had cleaned Steven, he pulled him out of the water, he dried him off, and he put him in the chair. And then Dennis took a bath himself in the same water he had just used to clean Steven. After a long soak in this tub, Dennis finally got out, he toweled himself off, he redressed Steven, and then he forced him back onto the floorboards and covered him up again. And he would remain there for the next 7 months until Dennis finally decided to dispose of him by burning him in a bonfire outside of their apartment building. And then after the body was completely incinerated and gone, Dennis remembered thinking, I can't believe I just got away with murder. And so he would do it again and again and again, killing at least 15 young men from North London, all by strangulation or by drowning or a combination of the two. And after he killed them, he would keep them stashed in his apartment for months at a time, in his closet, in his cabinets, in his bed, under the floors, all over his apartment. He had these bodies. And while these bodies were in his apartment, he liked to periodically take them out to spend time with them. He would tell police he found corpses to be beautiful. He was fascinated by them. But eventually, in 1983, he had so many bodies stashed all over his apartment that he knew he really needed to expedite getting rid of them. And so he began cutting them up and trying to force them down his drain, which eventually clogged the pipes. And so when Mike the plumber showed up and discovered this meaty substance in the pipes, and Dennis overheard him talking about it, that night after Mike was gone, Dennis had gone outside and attempted to clear the rest of the remains from the pipes. But he wasn't aware there were still remains stuck in the pipe that led to his specific apartment. Dennis Nielsen confessed to killing 15 young men and attempting to kill at least 7 others, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Dennis never showed any remorse, nor did he show any desire to want to be free again. He actually said he deserved to be in jail for what he did. In 2018, Dennis Nielsen would die in prison at the age of 72. If you got something out of today's video, and you haven't done this already, the next time you're in a very crowded parking lot and you see the like button driving around looking for a spot, flag them down and point to your parked car as if you're going to leave, and then go over to your car and spend a few minutes fumbling for your keys before just walking away. On August 28, 1984, an 18-year-old girl named Elizabeth went missing. On the first day she was gone, her friends and family went out looking for her, but they couldn't find her. The following day, when she still hadn't shown up and no one had heard from her, her parents went to the local police station in their Austrian town of Amstetten, which is about an hour west of Vienna, and they reported her missing. The police launched an initial search of the town and the surrounding areas, but after several weeks, they had found nothing that connected to Elizabeth and where she might have gone. A month after she had been reported missing, her parents came back to the police station, except this time they were carrying a note they say they received in the mail from their missing daughter. It was postmarked from a town that was about 2 hours west of Amstetten, and in this note, Elizabeth writes directly to her parents, and she tells them that she had grown tired of living with them, and she did not want them to come looking for her, and if she discovered they were looking for her, she would just flee the country. After the police read the note, they asked the parents if they thought it was real, if this was a legitimate letter from their daughter, and they said, yeah, they think it is. And then after that, her father, Joseph, suggested that maybe his daughter had run off to join a cult. That was something he thought she was getting into before her disappearance. After the parents left the police station, the police began conducting interviews with other family members and friends of Elizabeth to see if it was possible that she might have run off to join a cult. And virtually everyone they spoke to said absolutely not. There is no way she ran off to join a cult. That just wasn't her. She was a quiet, reserved person, and they had never heard her talking about a cult or anything that even resembled a cult. These answers left the police feeling very suspicious of the whole situation, and so they decided to look into the young woman's history to see if there was some other the reason she might have run off. In their research, they discovered that Elizabeth was one of 7 siblings that all lived together with their parents, Joseph and Rose Marie. Joseph was a successful electrical engineer and real estate developer who was well liked and respected in town, and Rose Marie had gotten married very young at the age of 17, and she had stayed home to take care of the kids. By all accounts, from the outside looking in, they were a very ordinary family, but as the police began to dig deeper and deeper into their history, they discovered there were some big problems behind closed doors. Despite his friendly, outward public appearance, Joseph was actually a ruthless authoritarian when he was home alone with his family. At night, when he came home from work, his wife and his kids would immediately stop whatever they were doing and go silent in hopes they might avoid a beating. The only member of the family that seemed willing to stand up to Joseph was Elizabeth, and she and her father would frequently get into screaming fights, and then as punishment for these fights, Joseph would not only beat his daughter, he would also prevent her from seeing her friends for long periods of time, and he would go through her personal things like her diary. Their toxic relationship finally came to a head when Elizabeth finally ran away from home 2 years prior to her most recent disappearance. She made it all the way to Vienna before authorities caught up to her and brought her back home. Upon learning about this earlier disappearance, the police became convinced that the most recent disappearance was yet another attempt to escape her abusive and controlling father. And so the police decided that this was more of a family affair, and they didn't push the investigation further. A year went by, and neither the police nor her family heard anything from Elizabeth, and so her case was closed. But 24 years later, a seemingly unconnected event broke her case wide open. On April 19, 2008, a 19-year-old named Kirsten was rushed to the hospital in Amstetten. Her skin was so pale it looked almost transparent. She was unconscious and suffering from seizures as well as lung and kidney failure. The doctors were able to stabilize her by putting her into a medically induced coma, but after running a litany of tests, they couldn't figure out what was causing her to have this medical condition, and so they were not able to treat her effectively. They assumed it had to be some sort of genetic condition, so they put her name into the medical database, but nothing came up. Her name wasn't listed. And so this was very perplexing because everybody's name was in this database. And so they took her name and they ran it in other medical databases, and her name didn't show up in any of them. And so totally confused by this girl who seemingly didn't exist, who was exhibiting symptoms of a condition none of the doctors had seen before, the doctors decide they have to speak to the guy she showed up with, an older man who was out in the waiting room. When the doctors approached him, he said he was Kirsten's grandfather, but beyond that, he offered virtually no new information. In fact, he was aggressive and rude and dismissive, and anytime they asked him questions, he would answer as minimally as possible. And when the doctors really fixated on whether or not Kirsten had some underlying medical condition, he would not give them an answer. He would just dismiss it and say he didn't know anything, but it was the doctor's impression that he did know something, he just didn't want to tell them. And this behavior shocked them because they're thinking the information he has could potentially save his granddaughter's life. Why wouldn't he want to give it to us? And so after this disastrous interaction with the grandfather, the doctors decided to get the police involved. There were just too many red flags not to. When the police arrived, they were surprised to find out that this older man in the waiting room was none other than Joseph, the father of the still missing girl, Elizabeth. The police asked Joseph, "What's going on here?" And he tells them that earlier that day, he had opened his front door of his house, and lying on his front step was a girl he had never seen before. It was Kirsten, and there was a note laying on her from his missing daughter, Elizabeth. In the note, Elizabeth writes to Joseph directly and tells him, "This girl here is Kirsten, and she is my daughter, so she's your granddaughter, and she's sick, and I can't take care of her. Can you and mom take her to the hospital?" While the police had many more questions about this totally bizarre turn of events, they realized that for the time being, they needed to focus their efforts on just getting Elizabeth to contact them, because they needed to know more about Kirsten's medical condition so they could save her life. And so the police went to the media and they put out a message on TV and on radio that was a direct appeal to Elizabeth that basically said, "We need you to come forward as soon as possible and speak to us so we can help save your daughter's life." And all the messages worked, because a week later, Elizabeth, along with her father Joseph, showed up at the hospital where Kirsten was staying. When doctors asked, Joseph did not get into detail about how he actually located Elizabeth. He simply said he found her and now she wants to see her daughter. The doctors noticed that Elizabeth, who was supposed to be in her early 40s, looked like she could easily be in her 60s. Her hair was completely white and her skin was so pale it was almost transparent, just like they had noticed about her daughter's skin. And so after they checked in, Joseph and Elizabeth made their way to Kirsten's room, and the pair went inside, and the doctors that were in there would say that Elizabeth looked terrified. She was hunched over and kind of slouched down, and she wouldn't make eye contact with any of the doctors. And as she was standing there looking at her terribly sick daughter, the doctors began asking her, do you know of any underlying health problems your daughter might have that might help us treat her more effectively? And Elizabeth was so scared she couldn't even talk. And at some point, the questions became too much for her, and she just turned around and walked out into the hall with Joseph. And once they got out into the hall, the police were waiting for them. They had been tipped off as soon as the doctors saw Joseph and Elizabeth come into the hospital. Elizabeth and Joseph were detained and brought to the police station, where they were put in 2 separate rooms to be interviewed. They first interviewed Elizabeth, and initially, just like in the hospital room, she was totally mute and didn't say anything. Then for 5 hours, the police grilled her with questions. Where had she been for the last 24 years? What happened to Kirsten? Did she have something to do with her illness? And they kept reminding her throughout these 5 hours that if she never gave them any information, and God forbid something were to happen to Kirsten, she, Elizabeth, could be held criminally liable. And so eventually Elizabeth, in a very small, meek voice, said, okay, I'll tell you the story, but you have to promise me I never have to see my father, Joseph, ever again. When she said this to the police, they could tell she was so scared that they said, okay, fine. You never have to see your father again. We'll make sure of it. Now tell us what happened. After that, Elizabeth clutched her hands. She took a deep breath, and then she told them one of the most horrifying stories they had ever heard. A story so disturbing that it would make headlines all around the world for months. It all began 24 years earlier on August 28, 1984, the day Elizabeth went missing. On that day, she told police she was at her family home in Amstetten when her father asked her to come into the basement to help him with something. Her father, for the last several years, had been constructing a bomb shelter in their basement, and he was now only one door installation away from being done. At the time, in the early 1980s, the Cold War was still very much on, and so building bomb shelters inside of your home was a relatively common thing. So Elizabeth goes down into her basement and she sees her father standing in front of this empty frame where this door is going to go that leads into the shelter. And so she walks over and steps through the frame into the shelter. She turns around and her father hands her this door, and she holds it in the middle of the frame while he secures it to the hinges. And then once it's securely in place, suddenly he swings open the door, knocking Elizabeth backwards farther into the shelter. And before she could stand back up again, her father had run inside and pushed an ether-soaked towel onto her face, knocking her unconscious. When she came to again, she found herself chained up in the very back room of the shelter. It would turn out this bomb shelter that Joseph had spent 6 years constructing was not actually a bomb shelter. It was a prison he was building specifically for Elizabeth. To get into this shelter, you would have to go down the steps into the basement, which looked like a typical unfinished basement. And then on the far wall, you would see these shelves that had things like paint cans and screwdrivers and other tools you would expect to find in a basement. But if you walked over to the left side of the shelving, there was a lock on the back of it that if you undid it, the shelf itself would swing out like a door, and then behind it on the wall would reveal a 3-foot-tall secret door. This secret door was also locked, but not by a key lock. Instead, it was locked by a keypad lock that only Joseph had the code to. And since Joseph was an electrical engineer, he took great care in ensuring this lock never could be tampered with or destroyed. That thing was going to stay locked unless he unlocked it. When Joseph entered his code into the keypad, he could open that secret door and it would reveal this secret underground prison that was basically a winding maze of small rooms with ceilings that were too short to be able to stand up all the way in. If you walked through this secret door and actually entered into this prison, you would start by entering this soundproof narrow hallway that went on for several feet before it entered into this very small bathroom area where the bathroom was unbelievably cramped and there was no doors, there was no privacy. And then if you didn't stop in the bathroom and you just kept walking straight through that first hallway, you would reach another hallway that was totally soundproof and narrow, and at the end of that hallway, it would feed into a very small bedroom that was so small that it barely contained the one bed that was inside of it, and then off to the right side of that bedroom was another door that led into a similarly sized bedroom. All of the walls of this underground prison were made of thick, reinforced concrete. That, combined with the soundproofing that Joseph had installed throughout the entire prison, meant no one could hear Elizabeth's cries for help. Also, the inside of the prison was heavily monitored by Joseph's security system. So truly, Elizabeth had absolutely no privacy. She was completely trapped, and the only way she was getting out was if her father freed her. For the first 5 years of her imprisonment, she remained in that dungeon all alone. Her only connection to the outside world was her father, who would come down almost every night to drop off basic supplies and to assault her. As far as Joseph's wife and his other kids knew, he was just spending all this time in the basement because that's where he worked when he was not at the office. In 1988, Elizabeth became pregnant with her father's child. She was terrified of the pregnancy and begged Joseph to at least allow her to deliver the child in a hospital. But he refused. He wasn't willing to potentially expose himself for what he was doing. And so he gave her a book about childbirth, and he gave her a pair of scissors to cut the umbilical cord, and he said, "Good luck." And so on August 30th, Elizabeth delivered her daughter, Kirsten, alone in that basement. Following the birth of Kirsten, Elizabeth would deliver 6 more of her father's children, all the same way she delivered Kirsten, alone and in the basement. In 1996, one of Elizabeth's newborn babies, Michael, was born with respiratory issues, and so Elizabeth pleaded with Joseph to take the baby to the hospital to get help, but Joseph refused. He was worried he would be exposed. And so 3 days after his birth, the baby died in Elizabeth's arms. And after the baby died, Joseph just took the body, threw it in a stove, and incinerated it like it was nothing. In the late 90s, the 6 living children down in the basement were getting bigger and noisier, and so Joseph came up with a plan in order to reduce the chances of them being discovered. And so one day, Joseph went downstairs into the basement, and he took one of Elizabeth's youngest children away from her. And then he threatened her and the rest of the kids down there that if they tried to fight back or if they ever tried to escape, he would seal off the basement and he would gas them to death. Previously, Joseph had punished the entire family by turning off their power and cutting off their food and water supply for multiple days at a time, so they knew he was willing and able to hurt them if he wanted to. And so when he took this young child away from Elizabeth, they didn't put up a fight, and the baby disappeared upstairs. And when Joseph's wife, Rosemary, came home, he put on this elaborate charade about how he had discovered this baby on the front step, and that there was a note attached to the baby, and it was from Elizabeth, their missing daughter, and this child was apparently Elizabeth's, and she couldn't take care of it, and she was leaving it here for he and Rosemary to raise it as their own. And Joseph had actually made Elizabeth write out this note and sign it to add credibility to the story. And so when Elizabeth's mother, Rosemary, saw this note and heard Joseph's story, she believed it. Over the next several years, Joseph would steal 2 more of Elizabeth's young children and then stage having found them on his front step with a note from Elizabeth. And with each discovered child, Rosemary amazingly never asked any questions. She just took these kids in, and she and Joseph raised them as their own. Eventually, when these 3 kids got old enough, Joseph would tell them that their real mother, Elizabeth, was a lowlife and she had abandoned them and she didn't care about them, when in reality, their mother and their other 3 siblings they didn't know existed were locked up in the basement below their feet. Initially, investigators believed all of these children Joseph had with Elizabeth were all mistakes, but it would turn out that was not the case. Joseph would admit that the reason he initially imprisoned Elizabeth was because he wanted to completely control her. He wanted to own her. And so he decided that if he could just impregnate her as many times as possible and make her have all these kids, even if she eventually got out of the prison, no man would want her. She had too many kids, and so she would remain his property. And so over the entire time Elizabeth was imprisoned, over 2 decades, the nightly assaults by her father never slowed down. They happened thousands of times. But despite the horrific and tragic circumstances surrounding each of her children's births, she loved her children unconditionally and would spend all of her time doing her best to educate them and care for them. The 3 children that remained with her, that were not taken by Joseph, she taught them how to read and how to write. And when Joseph had given them a TV and a radio to keep down there, she would use those 2 items to try to teach her kids about the outside world, and she would promise them that someday they would get to experience it for real. Finally, in 2008, so 24 years after Elizabeth had originally been captured by her father, her oldest daughter, Kirsten, becomes extremely sick, and Elizabeth convinces Joseph to bring her to the hospital. And 1 week later, Joseph's heinous crimes were revealed to the world. Once police found out about the secret prison, they rushed to the house and they went downstairs and they used the codes and instructions that Joseph had given them, and they went inside and they freed the last 2 remaining children that were still there. When they brought them to the hospital, the youngest of these 2 kids, who was 5 years old, he didn't speak the entire time. He just pressed his face up against the glass of the car window and he stared out in utter amazement, because to that point in his life, he had never actually seen the world. After those 2 kids were brought to the hospital, they were reunited with the other 3 siblings that had been taken away from them years ago to live upstairs with Joseph and Rosemary. And apparently the reunion was very emotional and the kids were extremely happy to see each other. And then a couple days later, Kirsten would come out of her coma and she too would have a chance to be reunited with all of her siblings. Kirsten would ultimately make a full recovery. It would turn out she was suffering from a severe vitamin D deficiency. And vitamin D you primarily get from the sun, and in her 19 years of life, she had never been in the sun. As soon as the story broke about this family being trapped inside of this basement, everybody had the same question. How could Elizabeth's mother, Rosemary, not know what was going on in her basement? But the police had the same suspicions about Rosemarie, and they investigated her and they ruled her out. And they said she's not at fault here, she's a victim too. She had been so badly abused by Joseph that she lived in fear of him. And so when he forbade her from ever going anywhere near the basement, she listened. And if she ever heard any strange sounds coming out of the basement, or if she ever suspected any strange behavior by Joseph, she kept those thoughts to herself because she was scared. It's also worth noting that in those 24 years that Elizabeth and her kids were trapped in the basement, Joseph had over 100 people rent out a room inside of his house that was right over the basement. And in those 24 years, not one of those tenants ever said Joseph was acting strangely or complained about strange noises coming from the basement. However, one tenant who was there for a 4-year stretch had a dog with him the whole time, and every night the dog at some point would suddenly stand up, its ears would prick up, and it would start growling like it heard or it saw something. And at first, this tenant would try to see what the dog had seen or heard, but after never seeing anything, he would always just dismiss the dog when it did this at night. Later on, when that tenant figured out what was actually happening inside the house while he was there, he realized his dog was most likely hearing the faint sounds of the family that was imprisoned right below him. After a year of therapy and rehabilitation, Elizabeth and her 6 kids were given new identities by the Austrian government, and they were sent off to a secret location to start their lives over. As such, there's virtually no information about how they're doing today. However, anonymous sources have come forward and said the family has successfully reintegrated into society, and they are all leading relatively normal and happy lives. As for Joseph, he was quickly given a life sentence, and today he is one of the most hated people in his prison due to the nature of his crimes. He is so hated that in 2016, when he was out in general population, he was attacked by other inmates and had several of his teeth knocked out. And so now prison officials are worried if they leave him in general population, he'll be killed. And so he spends virtually all of his time in solitary confinement. He will be eligible for parole in 2024 when he is 89 years old. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button over to your house for a family dinner party and proceed to serve them a significantly oversalted dish. But before they take a bite out of it, make sure you say that you're so proud of what you've cooked and you can't wait to get their feedback.